You will never forget the day truth finally finds you. It does not arrive like light. It comes like a shadow that has been waiting in silence, watching every lie you told yourself. It whispers when you least expect it, and suddenly everything you built to survive begins to crumble. The names, the masks, the certainties, all of it burns under the weight of something too real to escape. You look in the mirror and see a face you have worn your entire life, yet it feels like a stranger staring back. That is the moment when the self begins to die. And what comes after is not peace, not madness, but something far more dangerous. The truth that destroys everything false so that something real can finally be born. There comes a moment in a life when the mirror no longer reflects the same face. It still shows the same eyes, the same mouth, the same familiar outline, but something inside the reflection has changed. The surface remains untouched, yet the soul underneath begins to twist, as if some hidden truth has finally awakened from its long slumber. That is the hour when the self begins to tremble, not from the cruelty of the world, but from something more terrifying, the discovery that everything once believed was never fully real. Truth, when it is pure, does not comfort. It shatters. It cuts through illusion like a blade through fragile glass. For years, a person walks through life believing the stories built inside their mind. The story of being good. The story of being loved. The story of being someone that belongs somewhere. These stories do not hold because they are true. They hold because they are needed. They are shields built in childhood to protect from a world that never promised kindness. But the deeper mind does not stay silent forever. It whispers in dreams. It stirs beneath sleepless nights. It leaks through the cracks of false smiles and polite words. And one day, without permission, it tears down the walls. What remains after that is not peace. It is an empty stage. No characters, no script, no applause. Just silence so heavy that it almost feels alive. That silence is the moment before the self begins to dissolve. Most people will never face it. They will keep busy with noise, with pleasure, with control, with anything that can delay the storm. But those who are forced to meet it know what it means to lose everything they thought they were. The ego collapses not with an explosion, but with a quiet, suffocating whisper. The person stares at their reflection and no longer knows the name attached to that face. Every belief learned through childhood becomes fragile in that instant. Every rule followed begins to feel meaningless. The self tries to cling to old certainties, but they slip like sand through shaking hands. It is not an external enemy that does this. It is something within that has decided the time for lies has ended. The mind once used as a shelter turns into a blade, cutting through its own illusions. There is no teacher in this moment, no savior, no comforting figure to explain why the ground is disappearing. The person realizes that what they called identity was never stable. It was a fragile construction meant to protect them from truths too heavy for a child to hold. When that construction begins to rot, the world tilts. Everything that once felt solid now moves like fog. The human instinct is to run back into the cage, to rebuild the illusion, to return to old lies and wear them like armor. But something deeper refuses. The old walls cannot hold because they were built on silence. Pain that was buried, rage that was denied, sorrow that was never allowed to breathe. All of it rises like black water flooding a locked room. This is not madness. It is awakening. And awakening is not a gentle process. It rips away masks carefully crafted over a lifetime. The smiling face becomes a hollow shell. The polite voice grows quiet. The eyes begin to see shadows they once ignored. What many call despair is not the end. It is the beginning of a confrontation with the part of the mind that has always lived in darkness. The truth that destroys the self is not some grand philosophical revelation. It is something simpler, quieter, and crueler. It is the realization that everything worn like armor was never real protection. It was a fragile disguise. And once that disguise falls, the world sees the naked mind. A mind stripped of its pretenses, its rehearsed strength, its comfortable lies. In that state, the person no longer belongs anywhere. Friends feel distant. Family becomes unfamiliar. The old roles do not fit. The familiar world now feels foreign because the one who used to wear the mask is gone. A different presence stands in their place, one that cannot pretend anymore, one that sees too clearly to return to sleep. Many try to numb it. Some drown it in distraction. Others run into ideologies, faith, or intoxicating certainties, hoping to build another mask. But the thing about truth is that once it is seen, it cannot be unseen. The cracks may be patched, but the structure never returns to its old shape. The person walks through the world half present, half broken open, never again able to believe the lies they once needed to survive. This transformation is not heroic. It is not beautiful. It is violent. It is silent. It is personal. No audience will ever see the real battle. It takes place in the dark corners of the psyche where language breaks down, where the mind eats itself to be reborn. It is the kind of pain that does not scream. It lingers. It suffocates. It burns without flame. In that burning, something unexpected happens. Beneath the rubble of what was once called identity, there is a voice. Not the polite one taught by society. Not the frightened one built in childhood. A voice older than every story. It speaks without language, and it does not comfort. It says one thing only: you were never who you thought you were. That sentence does not liberate at first. It crushes. The idea of being someone vanishes like smoke. Memories lose their weight. Achievements turn into meaningless echoes. Pain begins to move through the mind like a shadow with no face. Yet beneath the collapse, there is a strange clarity. A clarity that does not need approval, explanation, or validation. What terrifies the human being most is not the darkness itself. It is the silence after the mask breaks. It is standing in front of a mirror, seeing nothing but an empty shell and realizing that everything built to define the self was temporary. People call this a crisis, but it is not a crisis in the way most understand it. It is the end of pretending. No authority can save the person in this moment. No philosophy can protect them. No comforting hand can reach that far inward. This battle belongs only to the one living it. The collapse strips away the illusion that anyone can carry that weight for them. Every step forward is walked alone. The world outside may not even notice. It keeps moving, breathing, talking, and smiling. But inside the storm, something irreversible has already happened. The old self is gone. What remains is raw, stripped, exposed. There is no direction yet, no new identity to replace the old one. Only space, a terrifying, empty space where the person once existed. People fear monsters, disasters, and external enemies. But the most devastating force is this silent moment when truth turns inward and everything built upon lies begins to decay. It is the moment when the self looks at its own reflection and whispers, without hope and without denial, "I no longer know who I am." And that is the exact moment transformation begins, not with triumph, not with light, but with ruin. The kind of ruin that eats through everything that was borrowed, copied, or inherited. The kind of ruin that does not destroy to kill, but destroys to make space for something that has not yet been born. The silence stretches. The world feels distant. The face in the mirror stares back with no name, no history, no mask. A strange feeling grows, not of hope, but of a brutal honesty. The self has been stripped to its bones. And when everything has been burned away, there is nowhere left to hide. The silence after the collapse is unbearable. The mind, stripped of its names and symbols, searches for something to hold, yet nothing answers. The voice that once gave comfort has vanished. The illusions that once provided warmth are now nothing but ashes. The human being stands in the cold emptiness of awareness, seeing too much and understanding too little. There is no map for this territory. There is only the weight of existing without disguise. Days begin to lose their shape. Time becomes fluid, almost unreal. Thoughts drift without order. Everything that once gave meaning now feels hollow. The mind begins to question why it exists at all. It is not despair in the ordinary sense. It is not sadness. It is something quieter, heavier, almost sacred in its stillness. The person who has fallen apart begins to realize that the destruction was never punishment. It was revelation. The truth that destroys the self is not an enemy. It is a mirror that no longer lies. And when the lies are gone, all that remains is what was always there, raw awareness, unguarded and fragile. In that space, the mind begins to see how much of life was a performance, a ritual of pleasing, pretending, and surviving. Every gesture, every belief, every mask once worn now appears as a ghostly echo. The person begins to feel something unfamiliar, not happiness, not hope, but presence. For the first time, there is no mask between the inner world and the outer one. The silence that once felt unbearable begins to breathe differently. It is still heavy, but it no longer suffocates. It begins to speak in a new language, one made of symbols and sensations that have no words. The transformation that follows is not dramatic. It unfolds slowly, almost invisibly. A new way of seeing starts to grow out of the ruins of the old mind. The person notices how deeply they once feared truth, how much effort was spent avoiding themselves. Now there is no longer anything left to defend. The armor has turned to dust, and in that nakedness a strange calm emerges. The old world does not change. The same faces remain, the same voices speak, the same routines continue, but something within is different. The gaze no longer clings to surfaces. It begins to see the hidden movement underneath things. It sees how every smile hides a shadow, how every act of love carries the scent of loss, how every moment of peace hides a storm waiting to return. Most people would call this awareness suffering, but it is not. It is clarity. The person begins to understand that what once seemed contradictory, light and darkness, good and evil, beauty and pain, were never enemies. They were parts of the same pulse, the same living rhythm that holds both creation and destruction in one breath. In the early stages of awakening, there is still fear. The self wants to rebuild, to return to comfort. But something deeper knows there is no return. Once the illusion has been seen for what it is, it cannot be rebuilt without rot. The mind must learn to exist without the scaffolding of false certainty. It must stand alone in its rawness, trembling but awake. At first, the world appears darker than before. Every word feels shallow. Every dream feels suspect. But over time, the darkness begins to reveal something that was hidden all along. The dark is not the absence of light. It is the space that allows light to be seen. Without shadow, illumination has no meaning. Without death, there is no birth. Without loss, there is no depth. The truth that once destroyed the self begins to show its other face. The destruction was not the end, but the clearing. It was the burning away of the false, not the death of the real. The self begins to move differently, not out of desire, but out of understanding. There is no longer a need to prove anything, to be seen, to control perception. The new awareness is silent, observing without judgment. In this state, emotions no longer dominate. Pain comes, and it is felt without resistance. Joy comes, and it is held lightly, knowing it will fade. The person becomes a witness to the inner storm rather than its prisoner. This is not detachment. It is intimacy with reality. It is the ability to hold both beauty and horror without running from either. The deeper transformation begins when the self accepts that there is nothing left to become. The idea of transformation as progress fades away. It is not about becoming someone better. It is about dissolving the need to become at all. The self begins to realize that truth has no shape, no side, no conclusion. It is not something to be possessed. It is something to be lived through, moment by moment, like breath. This realization breaks the final illusion. The person no longer seeks meaning as something external. Meaning is no longer a prize to chase, but a pulse that lives inside every fleeting moment. The mind stops demanding that life explain itself. It simply watches as life unfolds unpredictable, beautiful, and cruel. In this stillness, the idea of a separate self fades. What remains is awareness moving through form. It feels the pain of others as its own. It sees the world not as a collection of separate lives, but as one continuous expression wearing countless faces. Compassion begins to grow, not out of morality, but out of recognition. The walls between self and other dissolve, leaving only the echo of shared existence. This is the point where language begins to fail. Words were built to describe separation, not unity. The truth that once destroyed the self now becomes the same truth that unites it with everything it once feared. The same darkness that once felt suffocating becomes the ground upon which the light stands. To live after such destruction is to live without armor. The person walks through the world quietly, not seeking victory or escape. They understand that suffering will continue, that loss will return, that love will hurt, and that death will always stand nearby. But none of it feels like a punishment anymore. It is simply the texture of existence. The self that emerges from this transformation is no longer the same. It no longer demands certainty. It no longer fears endings. It no longer seeks approval. It simply moves with the flow of the unknown. It understands that everything that was once called me was only a temporary shape taken by something infinite. The destruction of the old identity was not the end of life. It was the beginning of living truthfully. To live truthfully is not to be pure, perfect, or healed. It is to carry both the shadow and the light with equal honesty. To know that one cannot exist without the other. To know that the mind that seeks to destroy darkness is the same mind that creates it. The person who reaches this point no longer fears truth, because they have seen what lies beyond fear. They have walked through the collapse of meaning and discovered that meaning was never something given. It was something created each time they faced the void without running. Now, when they stand before the mirror, they no longer see a stranger. The reflection is still empty, still shifting, but it no longer feels like an enemy. It is a reminder that the self is not a fixed shape. It is a movement, a dance between shadow and light, between creation and destruction. The truth that destroys the self is the same truth that frees it. The collapse was never punishment. It was an invitation. Every illusion that died made space for something real to emerge. And in that space, something wordless continues to breathe. A quiet, endless awareness that does not need to be named. The person walks forward into the world again, not as who they were, but as what remains after the burning. They still smile, but it is not the smile of someone pretending. It is the smile of someone who has looked into the abyss and found themselves still alive. The same face, the same world, but a different gaze, a gaze that has seen beyond the mask and learned to live without it. And that is where transformation truly begins, not in light, not in darkness, but in the silent truth that holds them both.